Today's text comes from Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. Hear the word of the Lord. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Growing up, I often heard Brazilians lauding about how hospitable they were. I was greeted in Mexico with the very same mantra by Mexicans. I've heard it applied by people from Africa and Asia about their own respective countries. It seems that people and cultures the world over have this sense that they are indeed hospitable, and it is a very high value. They hold themselves in high regard for being welcoming to those on the outside, a stranger, a foreigner, a visitor. Of course, by the same token, I have also witnessed many people from these and other regions of the world being anything but hospitable and welcoming. It is not everyone toward whom we are hospitable. It is not everyone we would welcome with open arms. We seem to pick and choose who is worthy of our time, of our attention, who is a worthy recipient of our embrace and welcome. We may talk a big game about our being hospitable and open and welcoming and affirming. But would Jesus find reflection in those for whom we extend a warm welcome? Or would he find more reflection in those for whom a welcome is too often denied? Peter had made his confession that Jesus was the Messiah. Jesus had then called him down after his refusal to accept Jesus' characterization of what Messiah would be and the character of the reign that Messiah would bring. Jesus talked about suffering and death, and Peter would have none of it. A week past Peter's confession, the disciples are walking with Jesus from one town to another, and arriving in town, Jesus asks them, "So tell me, what is it you were arguing about along the way?" They were ashamed to answer. No matter that Jesus had been speaking about his impending death, they were focused on their expectations of a messianic reign that denied suffering, that would cast Rome aside and become Rome's substitute, become a structure to wield power after the guise of Rome. Disciples were definitely not in favor of Rome. They would have been among those proclaiming Rome's atrocities and decrying the evils of Roman subjugation. Regardless, they had adopted Rome's standards of strength, force, and violence as their own values. Their own values because they were Jewish values as well. They had allowed themselves to adopt the idea that when Jesus' reign was inaugurated, they would live as those who held sway among the Roman authorities and power structures. Instead of the Roman officials living in the lap of luxury and the trappings of power, the disciples would assume their roles, their standards. They would be the ones who would kick Rome to the curb and step into a vacated power structure, simply changing the names of the actors wielding power. Rome would be gone. The Jewish religious establishment would be usurped. The disciples would be among those who stepped in to take their places. It would be akin to all the power transitions from king to king throughout the histories of Israel and Judah. There would be one line of power and authority substituted for another, with no real change in how power was used, how the nation related to Yahweh, how Yahweh's justice required a completely new structure. Those who held power were hated, sure, but they are also held in a certain regard as heroes because they embodied the values, the ideals of a social system that sought to wield power as those above them did. They wanted those in power deposed, but their main consideration was simply taking their places, not installing a messianic reign with a distinct character. They couldn't really see past changing the names of those in power. They couldn't see any inherent problem with wielding power and ruling through force, fear, coercion. They just could not grasp any other form of government. They wanted to believe the only correction needed was benevolence and goodwill. After all, if you put Jesus, this one who came healing the sick, embracing the marginalized, feeding the hungry, if you put him in charge, well, then everything would be okay, because he would wield power and force and coercion with benevolence and goodwill. The leaders currently in power embodied the disciples' values of position and power, even while they failed at character. Jesus was talking about his suffering and death as the means of inaugurating the messianic reign. That was not enough for these disciples to embrace a new pattern of what life under Christ as Messiah would be. They still wanted a leader who exuded power. They just wanted that strong man to be Jesus. They wanted Jesus to take over and demonstrate how to wield force for good. They wanted to see God's will imposed on all people and all nations. They wanted to be important. They wanted to enjoy a measure of power. They wanted to wield influence. They wanted to be surrounded by people who would serve and honor them. They wanted the trappings of power they saw in the powerful men they hated, the ones who abused position to harm and exclude others from the halls of power. They expected the messianic reign to be fashioned after what they knew of power, coercion, and domination through force and fear. It was the world they knew. They did not see any other way. These disciples were not ruthless, power-hungry megalomaniacs. They were not narcissists demanding the world revolve around them and their petty personal interests. They had simply absorbed social norms and infatuation with power. If power fell into their hands, well, the world would suddenly be transformed. It would be paradise on earth because they would not use power for harm, for evil. After all, with Jesus as Messiah, power would be wielded in a way that helped those in need. They wanted power, position, and authority to enable them to do good, to enforce God's priorities. As soon as Jesus asked about their discussions, however, they knew they had been off base. They were ashamed that they had been talking about power. They knew at some level that their discussion was missing the point and falling short of God's priorities and God's values. Jesus' response still took them by surprise. First, he told them that to be great in the Messianic kingdom, they must be servants of all. They could deal with that on some level. After all, they had been serving the multitudes who had followed Jesus for feeding, for healing, for teaching, who had sought after the entertainment of coming to see Messiah and to hear him speak and marvel at the good news that he preached of a loving Father available to all. They had been serving. They had done some of the healing. They had cast out demons under Jesus' authority. Then Jesus did something completely unexpected. He brought a young child into their midst, a toddler. He wrapped his arms around this toddler and told them that the test of welcoming Jesus as Messiah was welcoming a small child under Jesus' authority. That did not seem to address any of what they were talking about. And yet, the selection of a small child turned the focus completely off power. It took the discussion off the use of force. A toddler has no power to determine political decisions. A toddler cannot express political will, much less wield it. A toddler depends on those who feed and care and nurture them with no more power than perhaps that of throwing a tantrum. And yet, we meet the needs of toddlers out of mercy, compassion, benevolent care, without hardly a second thought. We set aside our will and desires and care for them according to their needs. Meanwhile, in the halls of power, we deal with toddlers as irrelevant, unless perhaps they might be wielded as political pawns. We do not really welcome Jesus as Messiah until we are prepared to embrace the patterns and values of Jesus' authority as Messiah. To embrace Jesus as Messiah, to enter the reign of God, we must set aside what society has taught us about power, politics, force, manipulation. To accept Jesus, we must welcome those for whom we must care, for whom we must accept responsibility, those we must serve. That is the character of the messianic reign Jesus had been preaching all along. When Karen and I welcomed a cat into our home, we knew it would come with a litter box that we would need to clean. When our home was invaded by a couple of human babies, we bowed to the demands of diaper changes, late night feedings, interruptions in our schedules to take them to pediatric office visits, to goodnight stories, to feedings, to all sorts of invasions of privacy and demands on our time. We embrace the economic cost of caring for children with no thought that one day we would take out our expectations upon them to repay the investment that we had made in their lives. Along the way, we brought a dog into the mix with no consideration that we would not have to also invest time and energy and economic resources in caring for this member of our household as well. We accepted those responsibilities as a matter of course. If I am to be head of my household, it is not because I wield power. Under the call of Christ, it is because I have embraced my responsibility to care for those under my charge. If I would be great in the messianic reign of Christ, it is by bowing to serve others, to place their needs ahead of my personal desires and concerns. Such is the character of greatness in the reign of Christ. It's not about privilege, power, manipulation, use of force, coercion. It's about serving others who would depend upon us. If I can't do that, I am not welcoming Jesus. After all, isn't that what Jesus taught us all along?